Hi, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist, Episode 37, The History of Chile. So today's drink of choice is Carmen Gran Reserve wine. The winery claims to be the oldest in Chile, being founded in 1850. Wine has been grown in Chile since the 1550s, and while mostly only found in Chile itself, it has in the past couple decades become an important part of the Chilean economy, with the country being one of the largest wine producers in the entire world. And in 2013, wine exports brought in almost $2 billion into the country. Actually, while looking for historical articles to read, I found one all about Chilean wine and the history of its development, which is where I got that 2013 number from. The wine itself was pretty good. It was a nice red wine, although I wasn't really blown away too much by it. I just felt like it wasn't as flavorful as I was hoping for. It had kind of a subtle flavor, and I like my wines to be more definitively flavorful, I guess. But still, it was a good wine. This good wine, of course, comes from the Republic of Chile, located in southern South America. It has Peru to the north, Bolivia and Argentina to the east, the Southern Ocean to the south, and the Pacific Ocean to the west. Chile's long, thin shape is perhaps geographically what it is most famous for. However, it also consists of various islands off the coast of South America, especially in the south, such as half of Tierra del Fuego. It also consists of some far-off islands, including the Juan Fernandez Islands and Easter Island, where the famous Moai statues are found. Chile also claims a portion of Antarctica, claiming the Antarctic Peninsula, or O'Higgins Land, as official territory of Chile. I do want to be clear, these far-off territories don't really play a super important role in Chilean history, and I probably won't mention them again throughout the episode, but it is really fascinating, and it does technically make Chile a country that holds territory on 3 continents. But let's focus on Chile proper. Chile's long, thin shape means the country controls a lot of territory in various geographic climates. In the north, there is the dry Atacama Desert. Then in the central region, there is a much more pleasant and hospitable Mediterranean climate. And then more wet forest in the south, until you get to the far southern region, where it is much colder and has glaciers and fjords. What all regions do have is the Andes Mountains, which borders the eastern part of the country. Chile has over 18 million people in the country, mostly found in the central region, where the capital Santiago is located. Most people in the country are mixed to a certain extent ethnically. European ethnic groups like the Spanish, Basques, Germans, English, French, Croats, and many others intermingled with the indigenous peoples of Chile, like the Mapuche, the Quechua, the Aymara, the Agan, Coascar, Soknum, and even the indigenous Rapa Nui people of Easter Island. However, while many people are mixed, many people also do just identify as just white or indigenous, with around 50% identifying as white and 10% identifying as indigenous. Other ethnic groups present in the country include Afro-Chileans, Chinese, and Arabs. Language-wise, most people will speak Spanish, like in many other Latin American countries. Indigenous peoples may speak their own indigenous languages, although due to Spanish colonialism, many of these languages are spoken by only a minority of their community or are even outright extinct. Many people in Chile will also speak English, and there are small communities of German and Croat speakers in the south. Finally, religion-wise, most people are Christian. Historically, most people were Catholic, with John L. Richter's book, The History of Chile, stating at the time of the book's release, 2003, that 75% of the country was Catholic. However, Chile's Catholic population has decreased as the country has become less religious, although a plurality of the population still adheres to the Catholic faith. Protestant groups are also present, making up roughly 15% of the population, with groups like Anglicans among the Mapuche, Lutherans among the German community, and Baptist and Pentecostal groups are all present. Other religious communities include the Mormons, Russian Orthodox, Syriac Orthodox, Jews, Muslims, and indigenous religious beliefs. Finally, a growing proportion of the population is irreligious. I'll also say before I begin that most of the information I will use throughout this episode comes from Richter's book, The History of Chile. It overall gives a pretty good overview of Chilean history, going really from colonial Chile up until the 2000s. I will say because it came out in 2003, its final chapter in hindsight can look a little bit strange or incomplete, but overall it's a pretty good summary of Chilean history. So Chile before the 1500s was filled with many different indigenous people groups found throughout the country. In the north were the Aymara and Quechua, and other northern groups. Most northern peoples were heavily influenced by the indigenous societies found in Peru and Bolivia, trading with their northern cousins, and living in agricultural societies. The Incan Empire would take northern Chile in the 1400s, holding it until the empire collapsed with the arrival of the Spanish. The Incans would try to move south, but they would be halted in central Chile by the Mapuche, the largest indigenous group in Chile historically, and even up to today. The Mapuche lived in several different clans, which would form confederations when threatened by rival clans or outsiders. The Mapuche also practiced agriculture, growing potatoes, beans, peppers, and corn, along with fishing and making their own hard cider. The far south, meanwhile, consisted of several different ethnic groups who often traveled around the islands in or near the Strait of Magellan in canoes hunting for fish in small familial communities. The indigenous peoples would begin to encounter Europeans in the mid-16th century. Due to the Andes Mountains, it effectively blocked Europeans from moving from Argentina right into Chile, so when Europeans began moving into the region, they came almost exclusively from the north. While there would be a brief attempt by the Dutch in the 1640s to take Chile, Chile was almost exclusively colonized by the Spanish. The Spanish would begin in 1550 to set up several cities throughout northern and central Chile, and force many Mapuche to work in the colonial mines or on the Spaniards' farms. However, the Mapuche, being fiercely independent and upset with the mistreatment they suffered, began resisting Spanish rule, stealing horses, and learning European tactics and battle plans. In 1553, a large-scale revolt broke out, leading to the Spanish being decisively beaten at the Battle of Tucapel and the colonial governor being killed. The next roughly 50 years would see the Spanish and Mapuche duke it out throughout central and southern Chile. Many important, almost mythical figures and events would come out of this period in Chilean history, such as the Mapuche resistance leaders, Calpulican, Lautaro, and Galvarino, who actually had knives taped to his cut-off hands. The Spanish conquistadors, Inés Suárez, Antonio de Erauso, and Francisco Núñez de Pineda y Bascone. I definitely did not pronounce that last one right. And the creation of La Araucana, a national epic on the conquest of Chile. The conflict was particularly brutal, with Spaniards actively encouraged to take natives, whether they be friendly or not, as slaves, while the Mapuche, due to disease and war killing off large segments of their population, frequently kidnapping Spanish women, and eating those Spanish soldiers captured to intimidate them. By the 1600s, the Mapuche had effectively relegated the Spanish to the Central Valley and the north, with Spain unable to move south of the Biobío River. This led to several different things. Firstly, Spain treated Chile very much as a frontier colony, so Chile was poorer and more militaristic than other colonies in Spanish America. It also led Chile to being given its own autonomous colonial administration, since it was so remote. The central region of Chile would become colonial Chile's main population center, as the north was mostly desert, or mountains, so the Central Valley became where Chile developed the most initially. Mining was present in the north, but the Central Valley was mostly dominated economically by ranching, and starting in the 1640s, surprisingly, trade between the Spaniards and some Mapuche. Colonial Chile was quite egalitarian for the Spaniards, with Spanish men able to move up via trade or from encomiendas, or essentially indigenous slave labor, and Spanish women were able to take half of their husbands' lands once they died, which was often relatively young, with all the war and disease in early Chile. However, this system, as hinted at with the encomiendas, didn't offer a lot of advancement for indigenous, brown, or black Chileans, who were treated at best as second-class citizens or just as out-and-out slaves. Important changes would come to Chile in the 1700s. Chile would receive more European migrants, mostly from the Basque region, and even some Irishmen, who escaped tyrannical English rule back in their home country. These new migrants would set up their own economic ventures and often came into rivalry with one another, and regional tension began to develop around different cities in Chile. All of Spanish America would also see its Jesuits kicked out, due to tension between the Catholic order and political elites back in Europe, leading to many Jesuits, who were often educated sons of the wealthy elite, to turn on the Spanish crown. And finally, with the Enlightenment, liberal ideas began spreading throughout the educated elite of Chile, and new ideas on how to govern began to emerge. During the Napoleonic Wars, Spain was divided between the French-backed Joseph Bonaparte and the Bourbon dynasty, the traditional rulers of Spain. The instability back in Europe led Spanish-American revolutionaries to seize the opportunity and declare their own independent juntas. In Chile, a very unpopular and heavy-handed colonial governor led the Chileans to declare a junta in 1810. And began advocating for more autonomy and free trade with other states besides just Spain. The ruling junta was quickly besieged by problems, as those opposed to the reforms and those who wanted to maintain the status quo, known as royalists, began revolting or organizing in Peru. Meanwhile, among those favoring reforms, regional and political factions began to emerge, largely based around either the Carrera brothers, three brothers whose family came from the Basque Country and were more supportive of an independent Chilean state, or Bernardo O'Higgins, the bastard son of a father who was one of those Irishmen who moved into the region and became a colonial governor, and was more in favor of a pan-Latin American type confederation. A mini-civil war would erupt, and then be put down by the Royalists, who marched south from Peru in 1814, and forced Chilean revolutionaries, or patriots, out of the country, in what has been dubbed the Reconquest, or Reconquista, of Chile. However, O'Higgins wouldn't be stopped. He fled into Argentina, where Patriot forces were much more successful in driving out the Spanish. O'Higgins aided Argentine leader José de San Martín, and they together crossed the Andes in 1817, beating the Royalist forces in the Battle of Chacabuco. Afterwards, O'Higgins was proclaimed the supreme dictator of Chile. He would spend the next several years fighting with San Martín and Venezuelan revolutionary Simón Bolívar to eventually drive the Spanish out of all of South America. By 1824, Chile and all of South America was liberated, and while O'Higgins and some other patriots had hoped to form a pan-South American state, this, due to regional rivalries, wouldn't come to pass, and Chile emerged as one of many states on the South American continent. O'Higgins, after being declared supreme dictator in 1817, sought to build up Chile. He would create the Chilean Navy, built up the port at Valparaiso, took land from prominent royalist families, built the country's national library, gave greater rights to Protestants, abolished slavery, and abolished noble titles in the country. O'Higgins, while a founding father of Chile, wasn't uncontroversial. His policy of abolishing noble titles upset elites, he was accused of favoring foreign merchants by the business class, and him giving greater rights to Protestants and building a secular cemetery all upset the Catholic Church. He also killed one of the Carrera brothers when he arrived back to Chile in 1821, which was pretty controversial, since the Carrera brothers did also fight the Royalists for Chilean independence. For the American equivalent, it would be like John Adams killing Thomas Jefferson, two founding fathers killing each other due to political rivalry, which ultimately helped alienate even more people from O'Higgins. In 1823, he was overthrown in a coup and forced into exile. The next several decades would see internal unrest in Chile, as two factions vied for power. The factions were the Pulcones, or Bigwigs, by the way, great name for a political faction, a conservative group that wanted a strong centralized government, a strong social order, were very pro-church, and often came from families who were from large agricultural or pastoral haciendas, and the Pupiulos, or beginners, a liberal faction who supported freedom of speech, a federal government, were secular, and often came from either mine owners or those with new money or newly wealthy families. While these two factions deeply hated each other, often leading to civil wars such as in 1829, 1851, and 1891, they also weren't entirely polar opposites. Both factions were very much in favor of free trade and didn't want to rock the boat too much on economic matters. Both factions were also largely elitist groups, and didn't have much penetration into wider Chilean society, with universal suffrage only given to property-owning men. In the 1834 election, for example, only 7,000 people voted in a country of around 1 million. After the 1829 Civil War, the Pulcones came to power, creating the 1833 Constitution, and led what has become known as the Conservative Republic. The Conservatives would hold on to power until roughly 1861, when the more moderate José Joaquín Pérez came into power, leading to the Liberal Republic. However, the reforms of the Liberal Party politically were pretty tame. Suffrage was expanded to all literate men, and the power of the legislature was expanded, but the country was still dominated by elites, and mass political organizations didn't really exist. Chile in the 19th century would prove itself militarily against its neighbors. In a war from 1836 to 1839, it would defeat a confederation of Bolivia and Peru and grow its economic power in Pacific trade. It would then defeat Peru and Bolivia again in another war 40 years later, known as the War of the Pacific. It, using its powerful navy, was able to land and take strategic points along the Bolivian and Peruvian coast. And because Chile's economy was stronger than Bolivia or Peru, it could reinforce and resupply its soldiers much quicker than its rivals. The war would end in 1883, with Chile taking all of Bolivia's coastline, along with parts of southern Peru. It, while not going to war with Argentina, did get into political confrontations with Argentina in the late 1800s over land claims in southern Patagonia, and would face off against Spanish warships in the 1860s. All of this shows Chile was becoming a more powerful player in South America, was able to show off its strength, and during the 19th century was growing. It didn't just fight rival states though. Chile would, starting in the mid-1800s, start to actively push towards Mapuche land. The Mapuche had seen Spanish settlers slowly move into their territory over the course of several hundred years. Starting in the early 1860s, the Chilean army had started building forts in Mapuche land and built up a significant presence in the region. The Mapuche did try to resist, with large-scale violence breaking out in 1870 and 1881. However, while in previous conflicts the Mapuche were able to destroy isolated Spanish forts or units, railroads helped reinforce the Chilean army. Chile's population had also grown significantly, meaning more men were available to fight the Mapuche. By the mid-1880s, armed Mapuche resistance had effectively ended, and Chile held control of all the territory stretching from the island of Tierra del Fuego in the south to the port of Arce in the north. In 1893, the Chilean state seized all of the Mapuche's remaining land and sold off large portions of it, resulting in many Mapuche to enter into poverty and relegated to only small sections of their traditional homeland. As a bit of a lighter note, this period would see one of the strangest individuals in Chilean history emerge. A Frenchman, Orlier Altona de Tunas, upon reading the La Araucana we talked about earlier, became inspired and tried to set up his own independent state in Patagonia, the Kingdom of Araucanía and Patagonia. Tunas was largely unsuccessful and quickly arrested by the Chilean government. However, he did actually get the support from some Mapuche chiefs. There actually still exists a French organization that uses the kingdom's name to argue for Mapuche rights. Many of the people who settled on these new lands were new immigrants from Europe, primarily Germans and Croats. These new lands also saw large landowners buy up land. The new territory Chile acquired in either the north or south were rich in natural resources, with large nitrate, silver, and copper mines in the north, and forests and new agricultural land in the south. Many local businessmen were able to become rich off of this, but also foreign companies were able to take advantage of Chile's new territory. Particularly in the north, foreign companies were able to reap the most benefits of Chile's War of the Pacific, as British and foreign investors were able to make great profits off of setting up mines in the north. Some resentment over this, along with the poor working conditions of the mines themselves, and long periods of unemployment for the miners, saw the first labor organizations begin to emerge in the country. In 1891, tension between Congress and the president led to a civil war in Chile, which saw Congress win and the parliamentary era begin. This new era saw the middle class gain more power, the legislature grow in strength, and the state grow slightly more democratic. However, elites continued to hold the vast majority of power in the state, gridlock prevented reform, and corruption became the order of the day, as public service was directly connected with wealth. Rector notes that apparently voters would become upset when there wasn't any elections for a very long time, since it meant that votes couldn't be bought and they wouldn't make as much money. A sense that Chilean democracy is expanding, but also is extremely problematic. In 1925, progressive military officers overthrew the government for populist reformer Arturo Alessandri, leading to the end of the parliamentary era. While they didn't come to power in the parliamentary era, the Radical Party would grow significantly during this time. Chile in 1800 was a very rural state, with only 10% of the population in urban cities. However, by 1900, 20% would live in urban cities, and by 2000, almost 84% would live in urban areas. This change from rural to urban was helped by the development of government jobs and saw the Chilean middle class start to emerge. This new middle class was very sympathetic to the Radical Party, a liberal party ultimately supporting capitalism, but also was very secular and believed in creating a welfare state, a strong education system, and backed statist economic policy. While the Radicals were unable to win the presidency for several decades, eventually in 1938, with the help of an alliance of other left-leaning groups, they managed to elect one of their own and would hold the presidency until 1952. During this time period, the Radicals held office, they often expanded the state, expanded bureaucracy, and were very protectionist. The economic policies of the Radicals created problems, as they were often unwilling to raise taxes, especially on the rich, so they resorted to borrowing money and inflation rose. The Radicals also depended on other parties for support, and they frequently came into conflict with their coalition partners over unionization and foreign policy. While they hoped that expanding suffrage to women in 1949 might help them, in 1952, the Radicals lost the presidential election, ending the Radical era. While the Radicals were growing, another faction was also gaining prominence, the Christian Democrats. The Chilean Christian Democrats are actually somewhat unique in their far more left-wing origins when compared to, say, the Christian Democrats in Belgium or Brazil. The Christian Democrats emerged from several different progressive Catholic organizations in the 30s that fought for the rights of farm workers, often came from the middle class, and would become very powerful in Chile's universities, opposed the more traditional hierarchical view of the conservatives or Catholic clergy, and sought a communitarian society while rejecting the class warfare of the left or the authoritarian tendencies of fascism. While the Christian Democrats certainly weren't Marxist, they were more left-leaning than the conservatives and backed a mixed economy. They began picking up steam, and in 1964 they managed to elect Eduardo Frei Montalva as president, with the backing of the conservatives and liberals, and also money from the CIA. Frei, like the radicals, promised more statist economics. He expanded the welfare state, but also implemented progressive taxes and implemented land reform. However, the Christian Democrats won relatively few supporters with these policies. The right saw land reform the Christian Democrats were engaging in as the stepping stone to a Marxist takeover of Chile, while the left saw the Christian Democrats as not doing enough, and allowing events like the slaughter of Pampa Irigoyen to occur. Ominously for Chilean democracy, in 1969, a military regiment marched in Santiago, demanding greater pay for the army. Before we talk about the 1970 election, I should set the scene a bit more for the left. I realize this is the third paragraph in a row where I explain the ideological origins of a group, but too bad, deal with it. I earlier mentioned that the labor movement was emerging among mine workers, and many of these early unions would form the first leftist and Marxist groups in the country. While many different left-wing organizations would rise and fall over the years, I want to highlight just a couple. In 1912, the Communist Party of Chile was formed, advocating Marxist-Leninist thought, and starting in the 40s began receiving large amounts of support, especially among union members. In 1932, briefly a socialist republic was formed in Santiago, by elements of the military and leftist activists, although this republic had very little public support and was disbanded shortly after being formed. This republic would importantly serve as a boogeyman for years to come from right-wingers who feared a Marxist coup in the country. In 1933, some of the organizers of the republic formed the Socialist Party of Chile, advocating a more moderate form of socialism. Both the socialists and communists would actually form part of the coalition that helped the radicals get into power, until abandoning them in the late 40s. In 1964, some more radical leftists formed the Revolutionary Left Movement, or MIR, which began engaging in more violent protests against the government, seizing property, storming radio stations, and training for a revolution. Finally, we should talk about Salvador Allende. Allende was a Socialist Party politician and has served in the radical government as a minister and had since 1945 been a senator. He had run several times for president, but in 1970 he had managed to gather a winning coalition around him, of the Socialists to the Communists to the Radical Party, leftist breakoffs of the Christian Democrats, and various other small left-wing movements. Allende was also greatly helped by the fragmentation of the right, as the conservatives refused to back the Christian Democrats due to the land reform policies the Christian Democrats carried out, fielding their own presidential candidate, while the liberals had mostly dissolved as a faction. In the election, Allende managed to win 36% of the vote, which, while not enough to outright win since a Chilean president needs to win a majority of the vote to be elected, it was enough to go to the legislature. The CIA actually began making an active effort to convince Chilean politicians to not allow Allende to become president, with the CIA and the Chilean right actually assassinating a military general who was opposed to the military intervening in the political process. This led the Christian Democrats to back Allende and his ascension to the presidency. So Allende, in October of 1870, became president, and quickly went to work building up the country. He promoted left-wing economics, expanded land reform, nationalized the copper sector, increased government involvement in education and healthcare, and tried to create more jobs. Allende's government notably did improve both infant mortality and life expectancy, unemployment decreased, and the economy for the first part of his rule overall increased. He also moved the country away from Chile's historical ally, the United States, with, for example, Fidel Castro visiting the country in 1971. While the working class and the left generally loved Allende, it was a very different story among the elite and the middle class. Scarcity, for example, increased, with things like sugar, coffee, and toilet paper harder and harder to come by, until eventually a black market began to be developed for these and other goods. In 1971, a protest known as the March of the Empty Pots began, where middle-class women would march through the streets with their empty pots, protesting scarcity. A lot of scarcity seems to have been artificially created by Allende's opponents, but it still hurt the population, leading to resentment towards the left. Land reform was also quite violent, as rural peasants and Mapuche activists would sometimes seize land from large landowners, which led to vigilante groups being formed to fight anyone who tried to occupy their estates. Fascist groups began to emerge, with both the far right and far left engaging in street protest, bombings, and assassinations to try and defend either the status quo or the new revolution being undertaken. In 1972, the bosses' lockout began, where truck drivers, business owners, and middle-class professionals refused to work or open their shops, protesting Allende's government. This wasn't helped by America breaking off ties, severing Chile from one of its largest trading partners. This caused the economy to crash and led to even more tension. Elements of the right had since the start of Allende's government been advocating for a coup. On September 11, 1973, the Chilean armed forces staged a coup. Allende was dead by the time the coup was over, although not before giving a famous speech on the national radio, and members of Allende's government were arrested. The military took control and banned all political parties, and set up its own military dictatorship under General Augusto Pinochet. The CIA's involvement in the coup is technically disputed, although it seems most people will at the very least acknowledge that the CIA created the conditions for the coup and likely would have known about it. Pinochet's government was initially divided between those in the military who wanted a mixed economy and who wanted to model the state around Franco's Spain, and those who were influenced by a group of economists known as the Chicago Boys. The Chicago Boys, who got the name from the fact they were educated at the University of Chicago, were very supportive of neoliberal and free market economics. They very much wanted to reverse the trend Chile had seen over the past several decades of more government involvement in the economy, and were almost quasi-libertarian in terms of fiscal and economic policy. Ultimately, those more sympathetic to the Chicago Boys won out in the end, and the economy, universities, and Social Security were all privatized, unions were weakened, most of the land reform policies carried out were reversed, and Chile's exports moved away from just copper and moved more into agriculture, forestry, fishery, and wine, like the wine I got at the start. Foreign capital and products were encouraged to be brought into the country, leading to many more new international brands to hit store shelves for the first time, and foreign loans were bought up by an increasingly large amount of the middle class to fund a new consumerist lifestyle, and a new cosmopolitan elite emerged. Chile also grew closer to the United States and the West. Pinochet's government was infamous for its human rights abuses. It is believed around 30,000 people were disappeared, taken by the security forces, and then either tortured or just killed. In popular mythology, especially in more right-wing circles, the victims of Pinochet are all communist or Marxist terrorist. It is true that several Marxist groups like the MIR did try to wage a guerrilla war against the Pinochet dictatorship, carrying out assassinations and shootouts with the police. However, the numbers for these groups were relatively low. Instead, many of those who disappeared were members of Allende's coalition, which did include communists, but also include socialists, radicals, and trade unionists. There were also members of the military who opposed the coup, journalists, and international diplomats who were all killed by the government. Even the Christian Democrats, initially supportive of the coup, hoping the military would step down shortly afterwards, were targeted, with ex-Christian Democrat President Frey being killed under mysterious circumstances in 1982 after he started protesting Pinochet's rule. The police would also regularly patrol poor neighborhoods, arresting people just to intimidate the poor, and members of the military who didn't agree with Pinochet's policies would just be removed. Chile's economy went through 3 different phases during the Pinochet government. First, the economy suffered as the coup destabilized the country, and the military tried to regain control of the economy. However, in the mid-70s, the economy boomed, with production increasing, the consumerist revolution I talked about earlier allowing many in the middle class to buy a car or move up in life, infant mortality went down, life expectancy went up, and the economy was so good, economist Milton Friedman described it as the, quote, miracle of Chile. However, the benefits of this revolution weren't felt by everyone, as the working class failed to see the benefits of this and inequality increased between rich and poor. Then, in 1982, an economic crisis hit all throughout Latin America, and hit Chile particularly hard, due to many people in the country borrowing and taking out loans. Rector actually makes a really interesting point that the middle class was terrified of left-wing activists taking their land in the 70s, and then, in the 80s, they actually suffered with their homes being taken by the banks instead. Massive protests would break out. While the worst of the crisis was over by 1985, and the economy actually started to grow again, the trust the middle class had in Pinochet began to falter, and people began to turn against Pinochet. After the economic crash, the hardships that brought led many people in the country to turn completely against the Pinochet dictatorship. Pinochet agreed to hold a referendum in 1988 on if he should continue to act as president. Pinochet was supported by conservative groups who attempted to argue his rule had brought stability and neoliberal economics had brought prosperity to the country. Pretty much all of the left and center of Chile opposed Pinochet, saying the neoliberal model had brought inequality, in the long run hurt Chile, and that Pinochet's government committed a politicide, or mass killings of any who opposed the government. The Christian Democrats, Socialists, Radicals, and several other small centrist and center-left groups formed Concertacion and rallied together to oppose the Chilean dictatorship. They were helped when Pope John Paul II arrived in the country and criticized Pinochet. In the 1988 referendum, the anti-Pinochet campaign won 54% of the vote, and next year, Concertacion would elect Christian Democrat Patricio Aylwin as president. This ended Pinochet's rule in the country. However, importantly, the constitution didn't change and was only reformed, meaning that many laws and policies from the Pinochet era would carry over. Chile entered the 21st century a democracy, and one that looks set for a very long time as the success story of Latin America. I found one article from 2004 titled, "Chile, the Lonely Success Story, Economic Reform in Latin America," by the Harvard Review of Latin America. The article praises Chile for having a business-friendly environment, low inflation rates, having a high HDI score be compared to that of Hungary and Portugal, it reducing poverty almost every year, and it being transparent. I also want to read one of the ending paragraphs from Rector's book that I think does a pretty good job highlighting the general understanding of the state of Chile for a while, as a country that struggled through dictatorship, but has ultimately arrived on the other side with a democracy that, while not perfect, was almost entirely good, and with an economy that was beneficial for all of society. Quote, "Despite problems and clouds on the horizon, the democratic transition has worked. The election of Ricardo Lagos and the moderating influence that he has exercised over his fellow socialists show how far the transition has come. But to say that the policies of confrontation is buried and will not return is naive, especially when international recessions slow down the economy, political differences become exaggerated. A chronic economic downturn, therefore, could prove explosive. To their credit, however, Chilean economists and politicians have demonstrated both resolution and skill in adjusting policy to changing international conditions." Unquote. So, how true is all this? Did the transition work? Concertacion, even though they contained the Socialist, were both restricted by the Pinochet-era constitution and also lacked the political will to return to a more statist economy. While the welfare state was expanded, privatization didn't actually fully stop, with Social Security, education, and healthcare remaining privatized, and even things like water, sewage, and electricity being privatized. Unions, while they grew post-Pinochet, still were restricted due to Pinochet-era laws that hampered collective bargaining. The government was able, however, to invest more money into infrastructure projects, leading to a boom in construction, with many Chileans able to find a work, at least initially, in that field. The GDP would increase, as stated previously, and was ahead of other Latin American countries. The Chilean economy today, and really since probably the 80s, has been fairly diverse, with mining in the far north, winemaking and manufacturing in the near north, agriculture, industry, and tourism in the Central Valley, industry and forestry in the near south, while the far south has tourism and fishing. The Chilean economy at the start of the 21st century did have a lot going for it, and a large chunk of Chile's population was able to live comfortably in such an environment. But among Chile's poor and the left of Chile, there was frustration over the failure to reform the economy, inequality between rich and poor, and the rate of change. Chile post-Pinochet certainly wasn't experiencing political violence at the same rate as the 70s or 80s, but political tension was very much present. One of the goals of Concertacion was to punish Pinochet-era officials for human rights abuses. However, again, the Pinochet-era constitution, along with Pinochet still having a large number of supporters who believed he was responsible for the country's prosperity, prevented many Pinochet-era officials from ever being arrested. Around September 11th every year, both right and left-wing protesters often go out into the streets to clash with one another, or the police. Outright assassinations and bombings, while not common, did happen, with, for example, one of the writers of the Pinochet-era constitution being assassinated in 1991, a bombing in 2014 that saw 14 injured, and increasingly violent clashes between the police and vigilante groups, and Mapuche activists. Large-scale protests also broke out in 2011 over Chile's private universities. Concertacion held power for around 20 years after the Pinochet dictatorship. They lost power to a right-wing coalition in 2010, with Sebastián Pinera elected as president. The center-left would return to power in 2013, and then the Conservatives and Pinochet would return in 2017 under a new coalition known as Chile Vamos. I think the big thing to keep in mind is Chilean politics since 1990 has grown more contentious. Democracy had brought greater political rights and an end to the dominance of the military, but many people were deeply unhappy with the state of the country and the current ruling political elites. Starting in the 2010s, more leftist and Marxist groups started to emerge, with a coalition known as the Broad Front getting around 17% of the vote in the 2017 election, and a member of the Chile Vamos coalition breaking off in 2019 to form his own political outfit, the Republican Party, that unapologetically praised Pinochet. Chile in the late 2010s was seeing more new alternatives to the political establishment emerge and grow in popularity. In late 2019, protests began to rock the country. Initially, the protests were just over an increase in the subway fare, but eventually ballooned into a protest over the high cost of living in Chile, police brutality, inequality, Pinochet's legacy, and just generally anger over how the country was being governed. The protests in the country were massive, with protests marching for months in the streets, and over 1 million protesting in Santiago at one point. This was all despite the fact that the protests frequently turned violent, as the police attempted to remove crowds with tear gas and rubber bullets, which just led people to throw rocks and vandalize the streets. Overall, several dozen died in the protest, and many more were injured, with eye injuries infamously being quite common. Pinochet would be forced to compromise, and eventually a referendum was held where over 3/4 of the country voted to get rid of the Pinochet-era constitution. The protests would continue into 2020 until eventually COVID forced most people off the streets, and a presidential election would be held in 2021. This presidential election turned out to be very contentious. People were upset with the status quo, and so the traditional right and left-wing politicians were largely sidelined for new alternative voices. No candidate got over 50% of the vote in the first round, so two candidates, Gabriel Boric and Jose Antonio Cast, moved on to the second round. Boric, a student activist, was a member of the Broad Front coalition and was backed by the communists and various other leftist groups, along with those who took part in the protest, and represented for many a turn to the left and a president who would fundamentally reform the country. Meanwhile, Cast represented his polar opposite. The son of a former Pinochet government official, he ran under the Republican Party and represented those in Chile who felt the protests were wrong and represented the conservative backlash to the protest. Ultimately, Boric would win with 55% of the vote. Boric has since then served as president, the youngest Chile has ever seen, and has tried to promote more progressive policies. Chile also voted in 2021 for a constitutional convention that would create a new constitution. In 2022, a referendum was held on if Chile should adopt this new constitution, which ended up failing with over 60% opposing the new constitution. There have been several explanations from this, ranging from dissatisfaction with Boric and his government, controversy over certain provisions of the constitution, the convention not being representative enough of the entire population, and/or the referendum requiring everyone to vote or face a fine, which led people who don't often vote to vote against it as a protest of this. Chile remains divided between those who want reform and those who don't. Actually, the day I write this paragraph, May 7th, 2023, elections are being held for a new constitutional convention, which Chileans hope will be able to draft a new constitution. And actually, at the time of recording, which is May 10th, 2023, it seems very much the Conservatives have won. The Republican Party was the most voted for. I think they got like 35% of the vote. And then the more moderate Chile Vamos coalition got something like another 20%, so they roughly have like a full majority to control the convention. Ultimately, Chile's future is unknown. How much this new constitution will alter from the old one remains very much up in the air, but with this new constitutional convention, it looks unlikely to change a whole lot. So why does Chile exist? Chile was created by the Andes Mountains, which helped isolate it from the rest of South America. Spanish colonialism that created the basis for the first Chilean state, and the resistance from the indigenous peoples that greatly shaped the developmental direction of Chile. Chile's history has been filled with various factions and groups all competing for power. Whatever happens with the new constitutional convention, this fact looks unlikely to change, because as Rector notes, for many Chileans, politics is their national sport. Up next, we will go to China. Prepare for, debatably, the oldest country on Earth, emperors, lots of dynasties, impressive architecture, large-scale rebellions and civil wars, and a whole lot more. So yeah, thanks for listening, thanks for watching. Up next, I will talk about the political parties of Ukraine, and then I will start doing the history of China. I'm actually going to break that up into a couple of episodes. I'm going to release an episode pretty quickly after this, just kind of talking about the history of China. There's a airplane flying overhead. You're just gonna have to deal with it. It's the end of the episode. I don't care about audio quality anymore. But But yeah, the history of China is going to be split up into a couple of different episodes, and I'll explain that in a little bit. I also do know someone requested a very long time ago for me to do the political parties of Chile. I will do that eventually. There's just a lot of other requests. But I am kind of happy that I'm doing the history of Chile before I do that, because I think this has given me a lot of context around the Chilean parties that hopefully will be useful in that episode. But yeah, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. If you want, you can email me at whydocountriesexist@gmail.com for your thoughts, comments, suggestions, or hate mail. Take care. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. The sources I use for this episode are ABC News reports, Chile's Secret War, Al Jazeera's report, Chile, Pinochet's Legacy, Cornica Pan America's video, A Political History of Chile, Democracy Now's report, Protests in Chile were sparked by a subway fare hike, Geography Now's video on Chile, Jasby's video on the 1973 coup, Jacobin's article, Salvador Allende's brief experiment in radical democracy in Chile began 50 years ago today, Journeyman Pictures documentary on uncovering Pinochet's secret death camps, Mr. History's video, A Super Quick History of Chile, People's Dispatch article, Right-Wing Violence Against Mapuche People in Chile Widely Condemned, John L. Richter's book, The History of Chile, Revista's Harvard Review article, Chile, the Lonely Success Story, Economic Reforms in Latin America, Times article, 18 killed as hundreds of thousands of protesters take to the streets in Chile, here's what to know, Vice News reports, Why Chile Rejected the World's Most Progressive Constitution, and the aftermath of the attack in Santiago, the bombs dividing Chile, and finally, Wikipedia.